I looked at the CEO of the luxury housing development, a man wearing a suit that cost more than my tractor, and I felt a cold, calm sensation settle over my chest. Behind him, 35 pristine, white-trimmed suburban homes sat nestled in the valley, glowing under the afternoon sun, all built on the wrong side of a property line they thought they could ignore. Before we dive into how I reclaimed my inheritance and changed their lives forever, comment which country you're watching from and if you've ever had a neighbor try to steal even an inch of your dirt. This wasn't just an inch. It was 300 acres of prime bottom land that had been in my family since the 19th century, and today was the day the bill came due. I held the original deed in my calloused hands, the paper yellowed and smelling of old cedar and dust, contrasting sharply with the glossy, digitized maps the HOA board was waving in my face like weapons. They called me a squatter, a relic of the past, and a nuisance to their vision of modern living. But they had forgotten one crucial detail about the geography of this county. My grandfather hadn't just left me the land. He had left me the water rights and the manual override to the earthen dam, sitting 2 miles upstream. The morning had started like any other on the ranch, with the smell of wet grass and the low hum of the cicadas signaling another humid day in the valley. I was sitting on my porch, sipping black coffee and watching the mist roll off the ridge, when the first construction foreman pulled up in a white pickup truck to tell me I was trespassing on private HOA common ground. It was a surreal moment. Standing on the porch my father built, being told by a man in a neon vest that I didn't belong there because a developer had filed a fraudulent plat map. I tried to show him the stones, the literal iron stakes driven into the bedrock 50 years ago, but he just laughed and pointed toward the new cul-de-sac, where children were riding bikes. They had built a community on a foundation of lies, believing that a quiet bachelor, with a few hundred head of cattle, wouldn't have the stomach for a legal fight against a multi-million-dollar corporation. What they didn't realize was that I wasn't going to fight them in a courtroom where they could buy the judge. I was going to let nature do the talking for me. I watched him drive away, his tires kicking up the red clay of my ancestors, and I knew that the peaceful coexistence I had tried to maintain was officially over. The escalation happened faster than I expected, with the HOA president, a woman named Sandra who treated the neighborhood like her personal kingdom. Arriving with 2 sheriff's deputies by noon, she stood on the edge of my gravel driveway, her heels sinking into the soft earth, demanding that I vacate the premises within 48 hours or face forcible removal. The deputies looked uncomfortable, knowing my family's history in this town, but the paperwork Sandra held looked official enough to give them pause in the heat of the moment. Neighbors began to gather at the edge of the property line, some whispering in hushed tones while others shouted insults, calling my farmhouse an eyesore that was tanking their property values. I stood there in my grease-stained work shirt, feeling the weight of their judgment, a lone man against a mob of people who thought money gave them the right to redraw the world. Sandra stepped forward, her voice shrill and dripping with condescension, telling me that the march of progress didn't stop for stubborn old men who couldn't adapt. I didn't raise my voice once, merely asking her if she had checked the flood zone, easements before they laid the asphalt for those 35 houses. But she just smirked and told me they had engineered away the risks. By mid-afternoon, the tension had reached a breaking point as a moving van pulled up to one of the disputed houses, ready to unload furniture for a family that had no idea they were moving onto stolen land. I walked back into my house, grabbed my keys, and headed toward my old Jeep, the engine groaning to life with a roar that seemed to startle the onlookers gathered at the fence. Sandra tried to block my path, claiming I couldn't leave until I signed a voluntary surrender of the acreage, but I just shifted into gear and let the vehicle roll forward until she was forced to step aside. I could see the confusion in her eyes. She expected me to beg, to cry, or to offer a settlement. But instead, I was headed for the hills where the creek began its descent. The air felt heavy, the sky turning a bruised purple as a summer storm started to brew in the distance, adding a layer of atmospheric dread to the unfolding drama. As I drove up the winding dirt path toward the dam, I looked back at the valley and saw the 35 houses lined up like dominoes, beautiful and fragile. They had ignored the warnings, ignored the surveys, and ignored the man who held the keys to the reservoir that kept their man-made lake at a picturesque, steady level. The walk up the final embankment to the dam's control house was silent, save for the sound of my own boots, crunching on the gravel, and the distant thunder rolling over the peaks. I unlocked the heavy iron door, the hinges screaming from years of disuse, and stepped into the cool, damp interior where the massive brass wheels of the sluice gates waited for my command. I thought about the letters I'd sent, the phone calls I'd made, and the way the HOA board had laughed when I told them. The valley floor was a natural drainage basin. They had filled in the wetlands, paved over the soak zones, and built their basement-level garages right in the path of what my grandfather called the Great Gulp. I placed my hands on the primary wheel, feeling the cold metal vibrate with the pressure of millions of gallons of water pressing against the concrete wall on the other side. This wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration, about returning the land to its natural state and showing these people that gravity and law were two things they couldn't bribe. With a heavy heave, I began to turn the wheel, the gears groaning as the first inch of the gate lifted, sending a low-frequency rumble through the ground that I could feel in my very teeth. Down in the valley, the first sign of the change was a subtle rise in the ornamental lake that sat at the center of the development, the water turning from a clear blue to a murky, silt-filled brown. I stood on the ridge and watched through binoculars as the neighbors began to notice the water encroaching on their manicured lawns, their initial confusion quickly turning into visible, frantic panic. Sandra was out in the street, gesturing wildly at the rising tide, her engineered drainage systems failing instantly as the sheer volume of the reservoir began to reclaim the path it had traveled for 10,000 years. The houses weren't being swept away. I wasn't a murderer, but the basements were filling. The crawl spaces were drowning, and the expensive landscaping was being buried under a foot of river sludge. I saw the sheriff's deputies throwing up their hands, realizing that this wasn't a police matter anymore, but a catastrophic failure of the developer's due diligence that they had bragged about. The hidden truth was finally surfacing. The developer had known the land was a flood risk zone and had used a fraudulent survey to bypass the county's building moratorium, thinking the dam would always be closed. They hadn't counted on the stubborn old man owning the dam itself, a separate legal entity from the land they had tried to seize through adverse possession. As the sun began to set, the valley looked like a swamp, with the 35 homes sitting like islands in a sea of red mud and waist-deep water that refused to recede. The HOA board members were huddled on a high patch of ground, their expensive clothes ruined, watching as the luxury they had stolen was rendered uninhabitable in a single, watery afternoon. I drove back down the mountain, the Jeep splashing through the new streams that had formed across the roads, and pulled up to where the crowd was gathered near my untouched farmhouse. The silence that met me was profound, broken only by the sound of rushing water and the distant sob of a homeowner who realized their insurance wouldn't cover a man-made flood caused by illegal construction. I stepped out of the car, held up the original 1920s deed and the state-certified dam operator's license, and looked Sandra directly in the eyes while the cameras of a local news crew captured everything. I told her that if she wanted the water to stop, she could start by signing a confession of land theft and a full refund for every family she had tricked into buying on my property. Justice wasn't a gavel hitting a block. It was the sound of a river finding its way home and the look on a bully's face when they realize the little guy has the power to wash their empire away. The aftermath was a legal hurricane that lasted for 3 years, resulting in the total dissolution of the HOA and the imprisonment of the developer for multiple counts of fraud and racketeering. The homes were eventually demolished because the soil was no longer stable for heavy structures, and the land was returned to its natural state, just as my grandfather had always intended it to be. I didn't take a dime of their settlement money for myself. I used it to establish a wildlife sanctuary and a permanent conservation easement so that no one could ever try to pave over this valley again. The neighbors who were victims of the developers' lies were compensated from the corporation's seized assets, and many of them actually thanked me for exposing the rot before their houses collapsed on their own. I still sit on my porch every evening, the air smelling of clean water and wild mint, watching the deer graze where a cul-de-sac once stood in defiance of the earth. True authority isn't found in a title or a bank account. It's found in the honor of the land and the courage to protect what is rightfully yours, no matter the cost. If you think I did the right thing, or if you think I went too far, let me know in the comments. And don't forget to like and share this story of mountain justice. Would you like me to write a follow-up about the legal battle that sent the developer to prison?